So please remain muted until time for question and answers. And I'd like to introduce Ron Byrne, who will introduce our speaker and presentation for today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Our speaker this morning is Ramona Caponegro, who is the curator of the Baldwin Library, which is part of the special collections area in the Smathers. And just for reference, the Baldwin has one of the largest collections of children's and young adult literature in the world. And it's really one of the crown jewels of special collections at the Smathers. Ramona received her bachelor's degree back in 2004 from St. Louis University, an area that we both know well. We talked about that last week. She then came to UF for her master's and her PhD in English. And while she was here, she did the usual graduate student things. She researched, edited, taught, published, all with sort of increasing focus on children's and young adult literature. At that time, she also served as an assistant to the curator of the then curator of the Baldwin. And I'm guessing that's when she got on the Smathers Library radar. One other thing that she did while she was at UF that I thought was particularly fun to think about, she served on the staff of WUFT-FM, the NPR station out of University of Florida. She was one of the producers of their radio show called Recess, which aired daily 3-minute segments on all aspects of children's literature, young adult literature, aimed at that audience and their parents. And so she produced, wrote, and even went on air. She was on the radio, which I thought was really kind of special. WFT is one of my things I wake up to every morning. Getting back to Ramona, she got her PhD in 2010 in English, and then went off to Eastern Michigan University to the faculty there for really 9 rather exceptional years, during which she started as an assistant professor and then became an associate professor and finally a full professor. And about the time that happened, back in Gainesville, the Smathers was looking for a new curator for the Baldwin collection. And I'm guessing Ramona's name kind of came up on their Rolodex. And at any rate, fast forward to mid-year 2021, and you find Ramona moving back to Gainesville to take over as the leader of the Baldwin. So she's gone full circle, and we're really glad to have her back. Ramona is going to speak to us this morning on the subject of development of the early readers, those books that teachers use to guide their young pupils on the path to learning to read. And with that, Ramona, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ron. Really appreciate that introduction. Woohoo. Okay, so no, I'm delighted to be here. As Ron said, I'm very new to being back in the Baldwin. I just started as the curator in January. So this is my first talk as the curator of the Baldwin collection. So I'm really excited to be able to share this morning with you and to talk about early readers, which are one of my favorite things, although admittedly I have many favorite things in children's literature. It's also really fun to be part of this whole series devoted to special and area studies collections, because I worked in the Baldwin before. I have some familiarity with that, but it's been really, really exciting to learn about the different collections here in Library East and the different work that curators are doing with things that are not children's books. And I know you're getting to hear about different things as part of this series. So with its founder, Ruth Baldwin's emphasis on collecting books loved and read by children, it's not surprising that the Baldwin contains a number of early readers from the past few centuries. And moving forward, I hope to build on its early reader collection, especially from more recent history, as these books tell us so much about the different understandings and expectations of childhood and education. Even though the early reader stage is often one of the shortest stages in a child's reading life. Children are often reading picture books before, during, and hopefully after they stop reading early readers. And again, hopefully they'll be reading novels and longer works of nonfiction for the rest of their lives. But early readers are often a stage, albeit a very important stage, on their reading journeys. So before we dig farther into early readers, what they are and how we got them, I'd like you to just take a minute and think about how you learned to read. Did you learn to read at school, at home, someplace else? What, if anything, do you remember about this process? Who helped you decode the words on the page? Do you remember the first book you read? Especially the first book you read on your own? What was the story about? Is there a particular picture that stays in your mind? And how did you feel when you finished reading that first book all by yourself? I'm guessing that if you all shared your recollections of learning to read, there'd definitely be some variety, which may or may not actually involve early readers. A fair number of people learn to read without this particular category of books. But the variety of experiences you've had is probably matched by the variety of terms and definitions applied to early readers. Over time, these books have been called primers, readers, beginning books, transitional books, taught series books, easy readers, first chapter books, and early graphic novels. And trying to parse out the distinctions between easy readers and first chapter books, both of which I include under the umbrella of early readers, is nearly impossible. My favorite definition of early readers is from Roger Sutton, the former editor of the Horn Book, who introduced early readers as easy readers and first chapter books, those distinct but related genres that don't teach so much as encourage children to string words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, paragraphs into chapters, chapters into books. In discussing early readers, many of the conversations end up being about the book's contents. So a key question that's central to teaching children to read is always, will this story entice children to want to learn to read? Is there enough going on in the book to encourage kids to undertake the hard work of learning to read so that they can figure out what happens next? So in Ling and Ting, Not Exactly the Same, a series that's all about two identical twins who look very much alike and who are always having to convince people that that doesn't mean they're exactly the same, we get to introduce them through a haircut story. So Ling sits in the chair. She does not move. Ling can always sit still. Snip, clip, the barber cuts Ling's hair in a smooth line. Now it is Ting's turn. She moves her legs and her fingers. Ting can never sit still. Snip, clip, the barber cuts Ting's hair. It falls on her nose. Okay, and you may have a really good guess as to what is going to happen next. But in talking about and in looking at early readers, the question is always kind of, is this enough activity to encourage the child to flip the page, to keep going with the story? Do they think they know what happens next? And are they invested enough in the characters and this idea to turn that page and to keep going? Coming to a classic early reader, Frog and Toad, a very beloved series. Another question that comes up a lot is, to what extent should the illustrations in an early reader extend the written text, go beyond the words on the page as illustrations and picture books usually do? And to what extent should the illustrations be mirroring the text and providing context clues to help readers better understand the story? So in this, where we meet Frog and Toad, we get to see Toad at the beginning of his day. So Toad woke up. Drat, he said, this house is a mess. I have so much work to do. Frog looked through the window. Toad, you are right, said Frog. It is a mess. Toad pulled the covers over his head. I will do it tomorrow, said Toad. Today, I will take life easy. So some definite connections between what's happening in the words and what's happening in the picture. You're going to know which character is which, by which one is in the window, which one is in the bed. And you're also really starting to get, in terms of the colors, a sense of the tone of the books, as well as a little bit of the emerging relationship between Frog and Toad, which of course is central to the success of this story and to most early readers. Jumping forward a few decades, we have Sydney and Taylor explore the whole wide world, another series that's focused on a pair of animal friends. And, you know, in this one, really thinking about another one of the key things with early readers is always vocabulary and sentence structure. So how do the authors and the editors decide which words are suitable for different reading levels? And how do they decide how to vary sentence structures? So as we meet this duo, Taylor is a hedgehog who lives with his friend Sydney in a burrow under Miss Nancy's potting shed. Sydney, being a skunk, liked to nap in the burrow. He likes to warm his feet by the fire. He likes to listen to the strong, steady heartbeat of the earth, which you can only hear underground. Taylor likes those things too, but sometimes Taylor gets ideas, big ideas. And of course, Taylor's ideas are going to get them out of the burrow and into the whole wide world. But think about these differences between the word choices in Sydney and Taylor and the sentence structures in Sydney and Taylor and what we just looked at with Frog and Toad. You'll see that there are more polysyllabic words in Sydney and Taylor, and also that we have longer, more complex sentences, which would seem to suggest that on the spectrum of early readers, Sydney and Taylor is probably for readers who are a little bit more advanced and a little bit more comfortable with reading on their own, or are working with an adult or older child who is helping guide their reading experience. And then finally, design considerations don't usually get as much attention as content considerations in early readers, but they matter a whole lot. So things like the size of the font, the space between the words, as well as the space between lines of text, and the arrangement of illustrations and text are really important in helping children who are learning how to read. As Kathleen T. Horning emphasizes, early readers need to meet the physical as well as the intellectual needs of children who are learning to read. So it's really thinking through how many words are there before kids are going to be worn out by looking at all of this text or overwhelmed by looking at all of this text. And also remembering that their eye muscles are developing just along with their reading skills. So having extra white space is really, really helpful because it gives those eyes as well as the brain a little bit of a chance to rest and breathe. So in We Are Growing, which is all about blades of grass growing and figuring out who can grow the tallest, the greenest, the curliest, the straightest, etc. There's very little text. You know, not a whole lot of words on this page, but it's very, very clear that the words are heavily emphasized. If you were reading this out loud, you would know when to raise your voice and when to put in some expression. But also for students, this is an easy reader. For students who are just beginning to read on their own, they're going to be able to turn this page after seeing 4 words, after reading 4 words, and also getting a really good context with that reader or with that ruler, and getting to measure the height of that blade of grass that is very proudly grown. Jumping ahead to the other side, going from easy readers to something that's definitely an early chapter book, getting toward the end of probably moving out of the early reader stage, we have Anna Hibiscus. And Anna Hibiscus lives in Africa, amazing Africa. She lives in an old white house with balconies and secret staircases, a wonderful house in a beautiful garden inside a big compound. The trees are full of sweet, juicy nectar. The trees are full of sweet, ripe fruit, and the flowers are full of sweet, juicy nectar, because this is Africa, and Africa can be like this. Outside the compound is the city, an amazing city of lagoons and bridges and roads, of skyscrapers and shanty towns. So definitely more words, harder words, more complex sentences. Still an illustration on every page, so you're still really getting to have that interaction between text and illustration. But even with greater text, look at the design choices. There's still a lot of white space, big margins, not too many words on a line before you move to the next line. So all of these design elements really help the reader start thinking through the reading process. And hopefully all of these things encourage them to keep reading and move forward. So in this presentation, I'll look at some of the predecessors of the contemporary early reader before looking at a few of the current trends for early readers today. I tend to see the evolution of early readers as an adaptable category with a cyclical history. Each new wave of early readers attempts to make reading instruction more palatable and enjoyable, as well as informative, leading to innovations in the category, but never completely replacing the older works, many of which continue to be read. Similarly, the new books and trends have never wholly replaced older ideas about literacy instruction and literary appreciation. Education and entertainment always remain the goals. So the New England Primer made its way to the American colonies from England long before the United States was formed. And the New England Primer was the book that was basically everywhere. In addition to the Bible, you had the New England Primer as one of the standard books. Records suggest that it first appeared in the 1680s, but the oldest surviving copy is dated 1727, and hundreds of versions of the Primer have been created. The Baldwin has 40 different copies of the New England Primer. Our edition with the oldest copyright has a date of 1785 to 1790, but it's a reprinted version created in the 1900s. However, we do have an original copy from 1816. The reprinted version, taken from approximately a decade after the American Revolution ended, includes an image of George Washington sandwiched between the alphabet section and the beginning prayers, showing how important he was to the creators of this primer, as well as to this moment in American history, as well as showing how some secular additions to the printer began to come in the 1770s and beyond. The basic contents of the primer have stayed pretty much the same for centuries. I'm guessing a lot of you will recognize the "In Adam's fall, we sinned all" line. It's certainly quoted frequently. And the primer would usually have an alphabet, lists of words of different syllables, prayers, Bible verses, and some catechism lessons. But different versions sometimes acknowledge different moments in history, as we saw with General Washington's picture, local geography and customs, and slight differences in religious traditions. The Puritans believed that reading the Bible was necessary to salvation, so they put an enormous value on learning how to read. The New England Primer was used in schoolrooms, but parents also used it to teach children at home, sometimes as young as 3 or 4 years old. beginning the tradition of having early readers as products that were intended for both school use and home use. According to David Barton, the New England Primer was the first textbook published in America. And for a century after its introduction, it was basically the textbook for students and was used in schools well into the 1930s. Its reliance on short biblical passages and speeches influenced subsequent readers in schools developed by Noah Webster, the dictionary guy, William H. McGuffey, and J. Madison Watson. So while the New England Primer remained central to children's religious and literacy education, it also faced increasing competition from the 1770s onward as more books for children and arguably more entertaining books, and certainly books that included more illustrations, became more readily available. The New England Primer adapted, adding more images and more woodcuts and engravings. And it also became more secular, though still moral, in terms of including fables and instructional rhymes. However, it gradually lost most of its popularity, although there are still printed copies readily available, and the New England Primer is actually still used in some homeschooling circles. While the New England Primer added a sense of importance and responsibility to the developing early reader, Jacob Abbott's Rallo series, particularly the second book in the series, Rallo Learning to Read, placed an additional emphasis on episodic storytelling, which is still a hallmark of many early readers. You want to entice them into reading the story, but you also don't want them to have to go too far before they reach a conclusion. Rallo Learning to Read, first published in 1835, contained many short stories about Rallo and his friends, including Jonas and Lucy, going about their everyday lives. Rallo learns to sail on a raft, goes on a picnic, learns to obey his mother, and prepares for his father to return from work at the end of the day. As the title suggests, he also learns to read. So at the beginning of this book, the second book in the series, Abbott provides a notice to parents saying that the difficulty with most books intended for children learning to read is that the writers make so much effort to confine themselves to words of one syllable that the style is quaint and uninteresting and often far more unintelligible than the usual language would be. The author's design here has been, first, to interest the little reader, hoping by this interest to allure him on to the encounter of the difficulties in the language and to the conquest of them. Hence, the more difficult words and phrases in common use are not to be avoided, for the very subject of such a reading book should be to teach the use of them. They are freely introduced and rendered intelligible by being placed in striking connections and familiar by being frequently repeated. With this notice, Abbott, who was a teacher as well as a writer, gives his educational philosophy, and readers get to see it put into practice as Rallo is taught to read at home by his father and his older sister, Mary. Under Mary's tutelage, Rallo works on learning the alphabet in 15-minute increments 4 times a day at 9, 11, 3, and 5 o'clock. Once he's learned to recite all of his letters, he then learns to recognize them through illustrated cards that have a picture on one side and a letter of the alphabet on the other side. And then he moves on to mastering lists of words and short sentences. Through this approach, it takes Rallo a little over a year to learn how to read well enough to ostensibly read these stories about himself and other children in the book. As Abbott explains, the stories are for him, Rallo, to read so that he may learn to read better. You, the reader, can read them too. The book links the progress of Rallo and the child reader, with Rallo being one step ahead, presumably so the child can follow Rallo's sterling example of burgeoning literacy. The child can also presumably follow Rallo's example of proper behavior, since the stories contain explicit morals, often about duty, gratitude, and obedience. As with the New England Primer, Abbott teaches that reading is a duty, though he also acknowledges that learning to read is difficult and hard work. And the books certainly make readers work. Rallo Learning to Read contains occasional plates of engravings that show scenes from the short stories, but they offer few context clues to help emerging readers decipher the stories as a whole. Because of this lack of regular visual context clues, as well as the polysyllabic words and the longer, more complex sentences, the Rallo books more closely resemble today's early chapter books rather than easy readers, if we look at the range of books in the early reader category. While Abbott's educational philosophy and his directing his notice to parents rather than teachers are important to think about in terms of the development of the early reader, it's just as important to note that Rallo is considered the first American children's book series. And series books have dominated the early reader category, if not all of children's literature, for centuries. The Rallo series launched in 1835 with The Little Scholar Learning to Talk, later renamed Rallo Learning to Talk, followed by Rallo Learning to Read in the same year. This first Rallo series would contain 14 books and would first be marketed as a series with series lists and advertisements in the individual books in 1839. So this kind of marketing where you would list all of the books that are in the series and, suggest how great they are because of the renown of the author or the intrigue of the stories seems like pretty old hat to us. We're very used to this kind of thing. But this was the first series to really do this kind of promotion work with a kid audience in mind. And of course, having this list is always great in terms of encouraging children to want to read all the books in the series. And from the publisher's standpoint, it's also great in terms of encouraging kids to want and adults to buy all of the books in the series. So the initial Rallo series was so popular that Abbott created two companion series, one about Jonas and one about Lucy, characters from the Rallo books, followed by a second Rallo series, Rallo's tour in Europe, where Rallo visits different countries and reports on what he has seen, starting in 1853. The Baldwin has over 500 copies of books from the Rallo series, with various editions and printings, and Abbott frequently tweaked as well as repackaged his books. So because of the way the Baldwin shelves its material, we shelve things by size as well as the order in which the books enter the collection. We don't frequently get all books by the same author or all books in the same series together. So it's really neat that here in one section, we have almost 3 full rows of nothing but Rallo books. Series books have had a contested place within the history of children's literature, but they've been at the center of early readers because of their collectability. How many of these books can you get? How many of these books can you read? As well as their familiarity. When you're just learning to read, being part of a series, there's a huge appeal as well as an ease in coming back to characters in a place that you already recognize. And of course, this idea of returning to characters whom you love is why all of us, including adults, frequently read a lot of different series. So I learned about Bow Wow and Mumu from educational resources written in the early 1900s, when they talked about reading instruction frequently as reading hygiene in the 1910s. And this book, written by Georgiana M. Craik, was mentioned as one of the stellar books that should be read by young children during this time period. And it was published in multiple editions between 1893 and 1943. The Baldwin has 2 copies, the one with the green cover published in 1894 and the one with the red cover from 1911. This simple story about an ungrateful dog and cat who run away from home before becoming friends and realizing that they should return home and be grateful for what they have can be considered as a precursor to the modern early reader, because it's actually one of those books that Abbott decried for its use of one-syllable words and very simple sentence structures. The book also includes a far greater number of illustrations than Abbott's Rallo books. At the end of the 1914 edition, the volume's editor, Joseph C. Sindelar, writes, Bow Wow and Mumu is one of the few books for beginners in reading that may be classed as literature. Written in words of mostly one syllable, it has a story to tell, which is related in so attractive a manner as to immediately win the favor of young children. It teaches English and English literature to the child in the natural way, through a love of the reading matter. It is from the character of the story that will, in the not distant future, replace the ordinary primer or reader with detached sentences, and which seldom possesses any relation to literature. So Craik, like Abbott, focused on storytelling and teaching moral lessons through her stories. And as Sindelar argues, brought it to the level of literature, always a dangerous word for English majors. But the two authors' different approaches to vocabulary choices, sentence structures, and use of illustrations reflect dissimilar approaches to the teaching of literacy skills, as well as changes in educational beliefs and practices throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s. So when I was looking for copies of Bow Wow and Mumu in the Baldwin, I found these two volumes, which seem to be an extension of Bow Wow and Mumu, again by Craik, in which they've basically renamed Bow Wow as Sofat and extended the story so that it's broken apart into two volumes. Unfortunately, these books don't have copyright or publication dates, though I can find copies of the books online with publication dates ranging from 1893 through 1900. So I'm looking forward to being able to dig in and do some more research about how Bow Wow and Mumu and Sofat and Mumu are all connected in terms of their publishing history. Both of the Sofat and Mumu books, though, contain lists of vocabulary words at the end, showing the words from each chapter, with words longer than two syllables broken apart. And this idea of breaking words with more than one syllable into two words seems to have been a common practice in the 1910s. In prepping for another class on Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I found a copy of that book from 1911 called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in Words of One Syllable, which did not actually just contain words of one syllable, but basically told Lewis Carroll's Alice stories, just dividing every single word into syllable breaks so that you could focus on each syllable as you moved along. Really interesting technique and different approach to one of the beloved stories of children's lit. We'll see more of this idea about being beloved in terms of the Dick and Jane readers, which came to be at the heart of a very public and well-publicized conflict about early readers in the mid-1900s. So the Dick and Jane readers were introduced in 1930 and were used in many American classrooms until the early 1970s. They reflected the national trend of teaching reading more frequently in schools during this time period rather than in homes, and the belief that children enjoyed reading about characters whose lives were purportedly similar to their own. At the beginning of this version, there's a small notice. Teaching procedures for the use of this pre-primer are given in the guidebook for the Elson Gray Basic Primer. A second pre-primer, More Dick and Jane Stories, provides additional opportunity for easy, fluent reading with the basic pre-primer vocabulary. This notice about teaching procedures at the beginning suggests that classroom teachers are being addressed as the responsible parties for helping children learn to read. Though interestingly, in the new editions of Dick and Jane readers that have been put out in just the last couple of decades, this front notice has changed and also now addresses parents and teachers as the people who are working with their children on developing literacy skills. The Dick and Jane books contain far less overt moral instruction than the previous books, though they certainly have their own social messages, right down to the white picket fence. They also have a more strictly controlled vocabulary, shorter, more direct sentences, and more illustrations than the books that preceded them. While these readers were at the height of their use in the 1950s and 60s, they were drawing considerable criticism because the United States' reading scores were falling behind other countries' scores, most notably the Soviet Union's, during this time period. Reading experts and journalists alike condemned Dick and Jane readers for their reliance on the whole word approach, in which children learn to recognize words by sight and repetition rather than by sounding them out through the phonics method, and for their lack of interesting storylines and character development, which they thought prevented children from wanting to learn to read. One of the most outspoken critics of the Dick and Jane readers, Arthur S. Trace, criticized the books heavily, declaring, "Programmed retardation is the teaching of reading in our schools is a three-headed monster. Vocabulary control, whereby almost all of the words in the English language are kept out of the students' readers, is the first head. The look and guess method, whereby a full knowledge of the sounds of the letters is carefully withheld from the student until it is too late, is the second head. The third head is the contents of the Dick and Jane type reader, which deny the students the opportunity of reading anything in their readers that is worth reading." He, Rudolph Flesch, and John Hershey all called for better stories to inspire more and better reading among elementary schoolers. And these calls were answered in 1957 by two books, The Cat in the Hat, written and illustrated by Dr. Seuss, Theodore Seuss Geisel, and Little Bear, written by Elsie Homelund Minarek and illustrated by Maurice Sendak. Both books launched lasting early reader series, or more specifically, easy reader series for children who are just entering the early reader stage. The Cat in the Hat was the impetus for Random House's beginner books, and Little Bear started off Harper's I Can Read series, with both of these series being marketed for home and school use. The Cat in the Hat was published a few months before Little Bear, much to the annoyance of Ursula Nordstrom, Little Bear's editor. The Cat in the Hat centers on barely controlled chaos as the cat invites himself in on a rainy day and proceeds to nearly destroy the home before, despite the fish's vehement objections that their mother will be coming home soon. As the cat makes his exit, then we saw him pick up all the things that were down. He picked up the cake and the rake and the gown and the milk and the strings and the books and the dish and the fan and the cup and the ship and the fish, and he put them away. Then he said, "That is that." And then he was gone with a tip of his hat. So as you can see, the text rhymes, the illustrations are imaginative and playful, and the book is formatted as a small picture book. Seuss worked with a controlled vocabulary, or a list of approved words given to him by the publisher, and wrote the book in response to a direct challenge from John Hershey, who in a 1954 issue of Life magazine insisted that Seuss could create a better early reader than Dick and Jane. Because Seuss succeeded and The Cat in the Hat was an instant hit, Seuss, Phyllis Cerf, and Helen Geisel developed the beginner book series at Random House. In contrast, Harper, under the leadership of Ursula Nordstrom, planned the I Can Read series from the start. Nordstrom was simply waiting for the right book to jumpstart the series. Little Bear was initially pitched by Minarek as a picture book, but Nordstrom saw its potential as an early reader. The text is quiet and reassuring, as are the illustrations, with gentle hints of humor as Little Bear engages in imaginative play, socializes with friends, and chats with his ever-watchful, if sometimes bemused, mother. So In this scene, Little Bear has been complaining of being cold and getting more and more layers put on him. Here's Little Bear again. "Oh," said Mother Bear, "what can you want now?" "I am cold," said Little Bear. "I want something to put on." "My little bear," said Mother Bear, "you have a hat, you have a coat, you have snow pants. Do you want a fur coat too?" The book is divided into short chapters and is in a smaller, more chapter-like format than The Cat in the Hat, a format we see in some ways more often now with early readers pitched to slightly more advanced readers. These two early reader series have published hundreds of easy readers, and they've inspired the creation, production, and marketing of thousands of early readers. Most children's publishing houses now have their own line of early readers, with dozens of new titles being published every year, both fiction and nonfiction, in just about every genre you can imagine. And some early readers are now beloved books that are being passed down to new generations. Phyllis Cerf, one of the founders of Beginner Books, said, "We want to publish books that take up where textbooks leave off." And most early readers take this approach, which allows them to work with both the school and the home markets, continuing the tradition started by the New England Primer and other early readers of addressing both audiences. While early readers have been popular for decades now, they've often been seen as instructional materials rather than as literary and artistic works. So having this category recognized by an award was a major milestone. The American Library Association created the Theodore Seuss Geisel Award in 2006, specifically for the authors and illustrators of the most distinguished American book for beginning readers. So if you're looking for excellent books in the early reader category, the list of Geisel Award winners is a great place to start. Sybil Awards, which are online awards for books, also have an early reader category. And at this point, most major publishing journals like School Library Journal, the Hornbook Magazine, Kirkus Review have sections devoted to early readers as well. So during the 2000s, in addition to increased critical appreciation for early readers, we've also seen two major shifts, which have mirrored some shifts in children's literature as a whole. The emergence of early graphic novels designed to help children develop visual literacy skills more fluently, as well as more diverse representations in the books we're offering to children. So Toon Books was started in 2008 by Francois Moulet, and its goal was to bring comics appreciation to younger readers. It's frequently done this by having well-respected comics artists such as Jeff Smith, Art Spiegelman, create works for very young readers. And also, like many, although certainly not all early readers, it introduces different levels that give parents and teachers an idea of how you can differentiate the reading process and which books your child or the child in your classroom may be ready for. Levels and early readers could be a whole talk unto themselves because some series choose to use them, others don't. Each series has a slightly different way of leveling, and they're now sub-levels as well. So it's all really complicated, but very interesting. And again, finding this connection between what the instructions being given in early readers now being passed on to early graphic novels. And again, being aimed at parents and educators, as well as sometimes directly at child readers. Mo Willems' Elephant and Piggy series, which started in 2007 and wrapped up in 2016, producing 25 very, very loved easy readers, also has a number of comics or graphic novels elements, especially in terms of its inclusion of speech bubbles and thought bubbles. And other series have followed as well, Baby Mouse and Lunch Lady both being popular. And then last year in 2021, I Can Read, one of the first two series of early readers launched I Can Read Comics as a spinoff focused on, again, these early graphic novels. I Can Read Comics and Toon Books are definitely not the only two series of early graphic novels, but they're two that have interesting places within the history of this category. Shifting to the other big change, which has been concerns about the lack of diversity in children's books, which has been a recurrent issue since the 1920s and tends to come up in a regular way every so often, with the most recent cycle hitting in about 2013, 2014, and continuing to today. We can see this idea of trying to introduce more and better representations of diversity. Danny and the Dinosaur, which was the third book in Harper's I Can Read series, published in 1958, has been a very popular story about a little boy who goes to a museum and comes out with a dinosaur, and they spend the day together. According to the Sid Hoff website, when the book celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2008, over 10 million copies of Danny and the Dinosaur had been sold, and the book had been translated into multiple languages. While it has been really popular, it's also received some backlash, particularly because of this spread. As Danny enters the museum, he saw Indians, he saw bears, he saw Eskimos, he saw guns, he saw swords, and he saw, page flip, dinosaur is coming. But a number of critics, including Debbie Reese, who has the American Indians and Children's Literature blog, focused on not only the stereotypical depictions on this page, but also the idea that Native Americans are on display in exhibits, which could suggest that they are not people living in the modern world, which of course they certainly are. So there was a lot of pushback, especially around the 50th anniversary with this spread. And then in 2017, the I Can Read series celebrated its 50th anniversary. And as part of that, they put out a commemorative set of paperback books in a very cute little collectible box of the Danny and the Dinosaur books. And in this book, they made a change to respond to some of the criticisms about the diverse portrayals in the original book. So now Danny no longer sees Indians or Eskimos, or interestingly, guns. The focus is on bears and swords before he meets the dinosaur. So that's one change, and other books have also undergone some revisions as they have continued to be popular. But then also importantly, we've seen a lot more new early readers created by diverse authors and illustrators featuring diverse characters that are expanding what's available to early readers and which children get to see themselves, as well as get to see the society in which we live represented on the page more fully. As Juana lives in Colombia, Mo tries to learn every sport he can, usually with varied degrees of success. Kayla and her dog King solve mysteries. Alvin Ho deals with everyday problems at school, as well as his issues with selective mutism. When he's scared, he can't speak. And Jojo McCoons is on a fictional Ojibwe reservation, going to school and hanging out with her friends. So the category of early readers definitely hasn't been new for a while, but it's clearly still continuing to grow and evolve in some very interesting ways. So thank you very much for letting me get to talk about one of my favorite things. If you have any questions, we're going to have a little time now, but also if you have any questions that come up later or want to share anything you were thinking of, you can definitely reach out to me at this email address.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ramona. I see Flo has a question or comment. Flo?
It's really a comment. Thank you very much, Ramona, for that presentation. I loved seeing the familiar site for me, but not for many of our participants, of the co-location of the Rallo series in the stacks. And I'm wondering if, I just wanted to comment on that. You know, you said that the Baldwin collection is shelved by size, and we do have these special classifications for the Baldwin based on the number of centimeters of the spines. But I also wanted to comment that when we do have series like that co-located on shelves together, it usually reflects an active collecting activity of the curator, in this case, probably Ruth Baldwin, purchasing a whole series of books together, perhaps at a yard sale or at a collector's or at the closing of a bookstore. I thought you might comment a little bit on when those kind of fortuitous things happen, what the curator does as the collector. I also note that when you first walk into the stacks, you see a bunch of Robin Crusoe books, and I imagine that that is also the case with those being acquired by the curator simultaneously or in the same shipment. Is that correct?
Yes. So yeah, besides size, as I think I mentioned, the books tend to come in order of acquisition and get shelved that way. So sometimes it's very, very random. We have over 200 Alice in Wonderlands in the collection, and I so far haven't found more than 2 together. Alice just seems to be something the curators have kept buying because of how important that book is to the history of children's literature, and they're just randomly throughout the shelves in different places as they've been added to the collection. Also, that's a book that comes in lots of different sizes. So we've got very small Alice in Wonderlands along with huge to be read to an audience kind of sizes. So they're all over. But sometimes the collector or the curator will really think, ooh, I really want Alice, or in this case, I really want Rallo books, and probably Ruth Baldwin. The numbers are early enough that she would have been the person doing the purchasing. She probably found a book dealer who had a lot of Rallo books, maybe a private collector who had collected Rallo books and was ready to give that collection or have that collection be purchased. And knowing that Rallo is also really important to the history of children's lit, and because Ruth liked to buy everything, she bought all of the Rallo books. So then suddenly we do have this lovely thing where you'll come across 3 entire shelves that are all Rallo, meaning those were purchased as a group rather than individually. And same thing, Flo mentioned Robinson Crusoe, which I think, I mean, again, very important book in children's lit, but I also think must have been one of Ruth's personal favorites, because my gosh, are there a lot of Robinson Crusoes. And they're frequently in the first 500 books that she bought. They were, a lot of them were right at the beginning, along with then you'll see 4 or 5 at a time added a couple shelves later. So that was clearly something that was important to her and that she kept coming back to. So yeah, it's really interesting how the collections develop, both in terms of having the opportunity to sometimes buy things all at once, and then also know that's a book that's important to you, important to the history. And so you're keeping an eye out for it and buying the different editions and versions as they become available.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Ramona, I did have one. When you, in one of your illustrations, it said something about it had comics in the subtitle. And I got to thinking, when I was a kid, my parents allowed us to subscribe to Disney comic books. Now, I'm sure, you know, they weren't anything that could be archived, you know, they were just comic books. But they had some of the same characteristics that you were talking about as favorable with early readers, in that the characters were recurring. There was Donald Duck and his 3 nephews, you know, every month. They used the bubbles. In that sense, it was like a graphic novel. The vocabulary I can't remember too much about, but I think it made it was a page turner. You remember how those, where would you put fit those kind of comic books into this whole melange?
Comics have a fascinating entryway into children's literature because children have been reading comic books as long as there have been comic books. Comic books were marketed to kids, but for a long time, comics books were considered separate from children's literature. Most librarians and teachers and a fair number of parents really decried comic book reading. That was not something libraries and schools made available for a long time. If you think about the 1950s and all the concerns about comics causing juvenile delinquency, comics have had a really contested period, and they did not start becoming more accepted as part of children's lit, although they've always been things kids have loved and read until the 1990s and 2000s. And at this point, comics, especially in graphic novel form, but also still in the much thinner paper comics, are very welcome in children's lit. And we've seen a lot of crossover in terms of those comics elements coming in to early graphic novels, as well as coming into picture books, really from the 70s onward. It was just kind of, children loved them. It took a while for adults to recognize the many benefits of comics and comic book reading for kids. And actually, the Baldwin has some comics. We tend to have a lot of the big little books, which are comic collections rather than in paper comics. But our pop culture collection has lots and lots of the comics as well. So you can certainly come here and see those.
That's interesting. Just one other thing I wanted to ask, and that this looks back now to television and Sesame Street. Because when our kids were young, I think Sesame Street was just starting to come on. And it also made a strong attempt to teach children to read. How did that impact what the publishers of children's books were doing, if anything?
So yeah, Sesame Street started in 1969. So at that point, we'd had over a decade, about 12 years of the early reader series going strong. And Sesame Street was another one of these efforts to bridge what was happening in formal education and school and what was happening at home. So in a lot of ways, it was very similar to the goals of early readers, where reading instruction happens in these different environments. Sesame Street was definitely another tool in that collection. And of course, Sesame Street would go on to have lots and lots of books, as well as merchandise associated with it. So there are certainly early readers, as well as picture books and little golden books that feature characters from Sesame Street as part of that whole expanding canon of early readers.
Yeah, it's just amazing how these things can sort of coexist and actually supplement each other, and how they cross over. Well, is there?
We do have a question here.
Oh, good.
Betty Kramer, go ahead, unmute.
I remember as a child getting a subscription to a magazine. It was not a comic book. It was not an early reader. I think the name was something called A Child's World or something. Do you collect any of those early magazines that we used to have back in the 30s for children?
Yes, the Baldwin has a number of periodicals, including a full run of St. Nicholas, which was one of the very first magazines for children. But we do have other early magazines as well. A lot of them are here in the stacks. Other collections have some of the magazines digitized, though, so you may also be able to find some editions and stories of the early magazines online.
Thank
but if
you.
not, definitely come here. We're happy to help you find them.
Thank you.
Great. Well, Ramona, this has been really fun. You did a terrific job. It's been so interesting, an hour well spent. If there are no more questions, we'll thank you. And let me remind everyone that next week, we're kind of going So it's almost the direct opposite. We're going back to early times. Our speaker will be Neil Weeger, who is the curator of the ancient manuscripts and ancient book collection at UF, which is also large and well known. And he's going to be speaking, drawing from that material in the rare books, on the legend of King Arthur. It should be a lot of fun. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks again, Ramona. It was fun. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.